In this video, Dr. Jordan Peterson explains how you can identify a traumatic memory, why you have it, and how you can heal yourself.
Anyways, Freud's idea in some sense, he had a somewhat, I hate to say, it was an insufficiently sophisticated notion of what memory was. Now I hate to say that because Freud was a very sophisticated person, but he did in some sense believe in the existence of an objective interpersonal world, and so he thought if something terrible happened to you when you were a child, that you had a record of the memory. It was there as the memory, as the event, and then you needed something that would, like a sensor, that would repress that, and then you needed a place for it to be repressed into, which would be the unconscious. But if you take apart a traumatic memory, generally speaking, with someone, and then he also thought that that repressed memory might be represented in a symptom, a symbolic symptom. So I think that the repression theory suffers from the inadequacy of its representation of memory, because here's a different way of thinking about it. It's more in keeping with the layer model, the hierarchical layer model that we've been entertaining as we progress. So imagine that you're molested by your uncle, because it's usually a family member, when you're 4, sexually molested. Okay, the first thing you have to ask yourself is just exactly what kind of memory do you have? Imagine you're completely sexually naive, which basically means you know nothing about the sexual act and its implications, or the mechanics, but this happens to you. So the first question is, how do you represent that? And the answer is, because to remember something, you have to represent it. That's the thing. You don't just have a memory of the event. It's always interpretation, because there's so many things going on. Well, so maybe your representation is pain and confusion, something like that. And then there'd be another layer over that, which would be the necessity for secrecy. Because, of course, the person who does the molesting is going to tell you, well, one of two things, 3 maybe. It's good for you, you asked for it. Don't tell anyone, or they'll think you're a bad person. This will be our little secret, something like that. So then there's that whole overlay of secrecy and inadmissibility, and what are you supposed to do about that when you're 4? How are you supposed to understand that something has just transpired that you're not allowed to share with anyone? You don't have a model of the world that's sophisticated enough to account for all that. And so then, perhaps from then on, what you do is avoid thinking about it. Now, that's not the same as repression. Avoiding thinking about something is not the same as repression, because it doesn't require an active repressor in order to do it. And then maybe, years later, you start to recall what happened, but what you recall is an unclear mess. And maybe most of it, because you might say, well, how are things represented as memories when you can't develop a sophisticated representation? And what seems to happen, and this is in a sense the reverse of Freudian theory, is that the event is represented in the body. And so you can think about the representation of event as a multi-layered neurological phenomena. And so if you encounter something that's unexpected or frightening, the first thing that happens is that very, very ancient reflexive systems act first. And those things are fast. And so that's the sort of thing that, for example, might protect you against a snake bite. If a snake jumped out at you, you're going to jump backwards. And believe me, you do that before you even see the snake, because it probably takes you a quarter of a second to produce a complex visual representation of the snake. And if you wait around for a quarter of a second, then you're dead. And so what's happened is that your nervous system has conserved basic reflexes that are only a few synapses long. And so maybe those work between your retina and your spinal cord. And your retina and maybe a very primordial emotional system like the amygdala is wired up to detect things like snakes, and it just sends a message down to your spinal cord, or slightly more sophisticated motor control systems that says, jump backwards now. And then maybe you think about it. It isn't even till after that your heart rate goes up and your blood pressure goes up and you start to breathe heavily, and then there's a wave of fear and revulsion, which is perhaps there to teach you not to do such a stupid thing again. You know, we don't exactly know why you would experience negative emotion, you know, or what function the negative emotion has, except that we do know that a pattern of neurological behavior that's followed by a punishment or a threat is less likely to be re-implemented in the future. Okay, so the reaction to the anomalous thing is bodily, and then maybe it's emotion, and then maybe it's image, like imagination, you know, what just happened, and then maybe it's articulated speech. But lots of things don't get past image to articulated speech, and some things, I think, don't even get past body. So I don't think that these traumatic memories are so much repressed, as Freud had it, as never brought forward for development. So I'll tell you a story about how this might work. Okay, so one time I had this client, she was about 27, I only saw her once. This is when I was just training to be a psychotherapist. And she came in to me and she said that she had been plagued by these thoughts of being sexually abused when she was a child. And I said, well, who was doing this to you? And she said, well, it was my brother. And she said, he was a lot older than me. And so I formulated this mental model of her being, you know, somewhere between 10 and 13 and her brother being somewhere between, say, 15 and 20. Because the way she described it was, you know, that she was overpowered by a physically larger male. So we talked for a while. And then she finally told me, I said, well, how old were you when this happened? And she said, well, I was 4. Okay, and then I said, well, okay, how old was your brother? And she said, well, he was 6. And so I said, well, look, you know, here's one way of looking at it. Like you're looking at it from the perspective of the 4-year-old. It's a regression in some sense. That's still how old you are as far as experiencing the memory. Here's an alternative hypothesis. Your brother wasn't a predator. You were both terribly supervised children. Well, you know, that made the lights go on in her mind. Because she'd never thought about it that way. Like, she'd never taken that representation, which would be her emotional experience as a 4-year-old related to a 6-year-old. A 6-year-old is a lot bigger and more powerful than a 4-year-old, right? It's you know, 50% older, so it's a big deal when you're 4. But if the issue for the memory is its relevance to current conceptualization and behavior, it was much better for her to update the memory, in a sense, and think, well, yeah, like a 6-year-old's this high, and like the 4-year-old's this high, and like what the hell were my parents doing anyways? And that's an entirely different story than the one that she had come in with, you know, and that seemed to be a great relief to her, and that's partly because, you know, if you're bothered by a traumatic memory, it keeps resurfacing on you, which it will, and it's actually one of the ways of identifying a traumatic memory, is that the thing won't leave you alone. It keeps coming up in dreams, and when your mind is wandering, it'll keep coming up when your mind is wandering, and maybe it'll come up when you're going to sleep at night, and like it invades your mind. There's a reason for that, and the reason is that the underlying emotional systems that are associated with anxiety, so those are mostly, it's a hippocampus and amygdala duo in some sense that are mediating those, they're an alarm system. And the alarm is something that's potentially dangerous has happened. You need to figure out what it means so that you can stop that from happening in the future. Okay, so you need a plan. And to get a plan, you do have to do a causal analysis of the relationship between your behavior and the traumatic outcome. That would be the first thing. And then you have to come up with a way that that won't happen again. And of course, for my client, that happened pretty much right away, because now she was a 27-year-old woman, and the probability that she was going to be subject in any serious way to a situation the same as the one she was remembering was 0.